You have probably heard before that capitalism is inherently exploitative. This is a common Marxist idea that has seeped into common discourse, and it has been defended on many different grounds. For the purposes of this video, I am going to examine whether capitalism is inherently exploitative as a mode of production, not necessarily as a political system. What this means is that you could still say that capitalism may be exploitative when practiced in a political system and still agree with everything said in this video, but you could not say that the capitalist mode of production, i.e. making profit by selling products in a capitalist way, requires exploitation to happen. So, to figure out whether capitalism is fundamentally exploitative, let's first understand what exploitation is. Exploitation, in the most simple terms I can imagine, is when someone extracts value from another's labor without fully compensating them for what they are owed. For example, if I were to produce the equivalent of $8 of economic value by cutting trees for a woodsman, I should expect to be paid approximately $8. If instead I get paid $5, then I could legitimately claim that the woodsman had exploited me, since he didn't give me what I was due. This is an intuitive understanding of exploitation because it operates on the basic principle of fairness. You get back the equivalent of what you give. Marx thought of this type of unfairness as necessary for the capitalist mode of production, and this belief essentially rests upon the following premises. First, value comes from production itself, not just demand. Second, for profit to be possible, there needs to be surplus value created, value that supersedes the total production cost. And third, only labor power can produce surplus value, since capital, like machines and buildings, merely transfer the value that is already embodied in them. From these premises, Marx concluded that the profit made in sales represents a portion of workers' labor that is unpaid. And if one were to accept Marx's premises, it is easy to see how this conclusion might be drawn. If capital cannot generate surplus value, then it logically follows that surplus value must come from labor. And if the value of a product is intrinsic, then profit must be extracted from that surplus value. And thus, the capitalist must exploit their workers. It is not merely a matter of choice, but a matter of systemic design. As you might imagine, affirming or denying Marx's conclusion is contingent upon the validity of these premises. So let's analyze each premise closely. Premise 1 is essentially the assertion of the labor theory of value, or maybe a similar objective theory of value. For now, let's grant, for the sake of argument, that the labor theory of value is true, in order to test the other premises. Premise 2 asserts that for profit to be possible, surplus value must be created. At first, this sounds reasonable. If value comes from production, then profit must come from capturing more than what was paid for. But this ignores an important factor, which is price fluctuations in real markets. Marx himself acknowledged that value is not synonymous with price. In fact, that is the focal point of the LTV, or the labor theory of value. that the real value of products lies within the production process, even though prices fluctuate because of supply and demand. However, if that is the case, then doesn't that mean that profit can be made by taking advantage of market conditions? Suppose I pay my workers exactly the full value of what they produce. If demand for my product spikes tomorrow, I can still raise my prices and earn a profit without underpaying anyone. Profit, in this case, comes not from exploitation, but from market conditions. The product itself still has the same value that I paid for in full price, but because the demand changed, I was able to make a profit. In fact, in a Marxist worldview, that is exactly what marketing and market research does for the capitalist. These services try to fine-tune the demand of the market so that the capitalist can maximize his profit. So even though exploitation of workers can happen, it is not a necessary condition for profit to occur. Premise 3 states that surplus value can only be created by labor power. Capital, Marx argued, merely transfers the value already embodied in it. Machines, buildings, and raw materials are like dead labor. They don't create anything anew. They just pass along the value that other workers previously put into them. I think this is the easiest point to counter-argue, because this might have seemed plausible in the 19th century, but it doesn't hold today. Sure, a piece of metal cannot really do anything by itself, and so it seems like the value it gives can be bought at once. However, we know that modern machines actively generate value. Artificial intelligence is the clearest example. For $20 a month, I can access a system like ChatGPT, which can write code, analyze data, draft essays, and do many tasks that were previously thought to be exclusively possible through labor power. So, is it really reasonable to think that this subscription only produces exactly $20 worth of value no matter what? Well, obviously not. The truth is that advanced software and robotics create new productive possibilities. Technologically, we are at the point where capital actively does things, just like a laborer. Under an objective theory of value, capital does create surplus value. To deny this, especially in the age of AI, is to ignore the reality that machines can now perform entire categories of labor on their own. In fact, if we were to suggest that anyone really creates surplus value, it would be more reasonable to assume that it was a machine rather than a laborer. Because machines are bought at a fixed price and not through a continuing salary like a laborer. Now, having already showed that exploitation is not inherent to capitalism even whilst assuming the LTV to be true, now it is time to also assess premise 1 itself, which is the labor theory of value. Now, I have made 2 entire videos about this topic, trying to explain why the labor theory of value doesn't make sense to me, but I can give you a summarized version of my main point. The labor theory of value holds that goods have an inherent value that comes from the work required to produce them. This might sound intuitive. After all, with high production cost usually comes a higher price. A handcrafted chair often sells for more than a mass-produced plastic chair. But when you push a little deeper, the labor theory of value runs into serious problems. First of all, we can give an account of prices without making any reference to inherent value, which leads to the question of why we would even postulate that such value exists in the first place. The examples are endless, but the most classic one is the one with water. Water takes very little labor to produce as compared to, say, in television. However, if you were in the middle of the desert dying from thirst, of course you would give any amount of money to get a bottle of water, whereas the same cannot be said for the television. That's because a drastic change in supply and demand creates a drastic change in price. Of course, the defenders of the labor theory of value have heard examples like this, which is why they make a clear distinction between value and price. And the problem is not so much that they cannot give an account of value, but that there seems to be no reason to do so. Imagine you are trying to sleep outside in the wilderness, and you are constantly hearing strange sounds. These sounds are of course explained by the conditions of nature, like the movements of animals and the wind. However, you could also take these sounds as evidence that there are ghosts outside whispering to each other. Now, even if I explain to you that these sounds come from nature, you could still tell me, sure, nature causes these sounds to happen, but there are also ghosts around, whispering to each other. The one doesn't exclude the existence of the other. And technically, that's true. Natural sounds don't exclude the possibility of ghosts. But why would you postulate the existence of ghosts if all of the sounds around can be explained via nature? Of course, I'm not talking about ghosts. I'm just trying to articulate the principle of simplicity. If you can account for a set of data by postulating 5 things, then there is no reason to postulate another 2. Similarly, there is no reason to postulate the existence of intrinsic value in objects if we can account for prices by only postulating the dynamics of markets. A possible counter to this might be that though value does not predict exact prices, it does predict the long-term price point around which fluctuations happen. It is true that fluctuations are not random, and typically they do dance around a fairly consistent price point. However, we can easily explain this phenomenon by just pointing at the role of the total cost of production in competitive markets. Under healthy competition, it is in the interest of the capitalist to sell their product as close to the production cost as possible, because otherwise another seller will sell the same quality product at a lower price, thus attracting more customers. Of course, the capitalist cannot consistently sell a product at a price that is below production cost, because they would eventually go out of business. So in the long term, for any given product, it is reasonable to predict that its price point will fluctuate closely to its production cost. This is not proof of some underlying intrinsic value, but rather it is a normal consequence of market competition. To put it bluntly, value is not created, it is assigned. But where does this leave us? To hold that capitalism is inherently exploitative on the basis of its mode of production, one has to hold some combination of the premises that I just refuted. Premise 2 fails because profit can come from shifting market conditions, not just from surplus value. Premise 3 fails because modern capital does more than just transferring value. And premise 3, the labor theory of value, fails because there is no need to postulate any intrinsic value when supply, demand, and cost can already explain the reality of prices. Without these premises, the claim that capitalism is inherently exploitative collapses, because exploitation then becomes a matter of instance or practice, but not principle. Exploitation does occur through coercion, fraud, and monopolistic power, but it is not built into the capitalist mode of production. In fact, exploitation of this kind can be said to be a result of human failure under almost any economic system. If we want to criticize capitalism, we should do so on the basis of real problems like severe inequality and market failures. But to claim that capitalism is inherently exploitative by design due to its mode of production is simply false. Thank you for watching this video. The content comes from an article that I just wrote on Substack. You can find my profile in the description of this video, and you can also find it just underneath the name of my channel. But for now, thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.